Okay, so thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited about this discussion. And I'm going to introduce our four great panelists in just a second. But first, I wanted to say that what motivated this event was a desire to celebrate the work of our grad students who have written and published op-eds in the Washington Post this year. The students that you're going to hear from are three of just 5 or 6, well, not just, but 5 or 6, which is a great number, who successfully published work that they started as part of a J-term workshop here at UVA, hosted by PhD Plus and the Jefferson Scholars Foundation's GAGE, Governing America in a Global Era program. And this workshop is led by Dr. Katie Brownell and her colleague, Carly Goodman, who lead this, talking about the op-ed writing process and the editorial process. So you're going to hear more about that workshop today. But I just want to add that this is one of a couple of different workshops and opportunities that PhD Plus offers on op-ed writing and writing for public audiences. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please reach out to me at any time. So for those who don't know me, I'm Kelly Oman, and I'm Assistant Director of Research Communication with PhD Plus in the Office of Graduate and Postdoctoral Affairs here at UVA. And now I'll introduce our panelists. So first we have Dr. Katie Brownell, editor of the Made by History column with the Washington Post, and Associate Professor of History at Purdue University. Bethany Bell, who is a master's candidate in the UVA History Department and a Bridge to the Doctorate Fellow. Brianna Frakes, a PhD candidate in the UVA History Department, soon to be completing that, I hear. And Cassandra Hanna, also a master's candidate in history here at UVA and a Bridge to the Doctorate Fellow. So welcome to all of you. And I want to start with Katie. If you could please describe what you know of the history and goal of the Made by History column with the Washington Post, the purpose of the GAGE workshop, and what you cover in that workshop. That's kind of a lot, but just kind of give us the landscape of what motivated this.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to chat with you about this. Made by History was really born, and actually the GAGE workshop were born out of 2 different frustrations. The Made by History came out of frustration that I felt my colleagues, Brian Rosenwald and Nikki Hemmer, while we watched the 2016 election, and we saw the media coverage of it, the commentary around it, and frequently people would talk about things being unprecedented, and certainly there were things that were shocking, but as historians, we could better understand them. And we felt that historians were not shaping the conversations. There were perhaps 1 or 2 talking heads that would be a historian, and it was the same people over and over again. And we felt that that did not really reflect the field that is so dynamic, so diverse, and really groundbreaking in terms of insights it could provide. And so we pitched the idea that we would run a historical column that would bring in analysis of contemporary events from a range of different scholars, and proposed running 11 pieces a week, which has been a lot at times. And at first we really wondered, would there be enough to actually publish? Would there be a demand among scholars to do this? And we have found that there have been these moments of crisis. Charlottesville, actually, the attacks in Charlottesville were, that was that first big moment where we were so proud because historians stepped up and helped people understand the stakes of these conversations about memory, Confederate monuments, which of course Bethany can talk about as well. And it's time and time again, moments of crisis, the pandemic, the protests in 2020 around issues of racial inequality. All of these things historians have really helped to shed light on and to help the understanding. And so that's what we do at Made by History. Our goal is to bring in the best scholarship on a particular topic, that the expert that can speak to it, and whether they're at an Ivy League or whether they're at a small community college, and to kind of even the playing field for historians that they can enter the media, and shape those conversations, shape understanding about that. And you know, the other motivating factor is that, you know, history is frequently weaponized by a variety of different partisans. And so our goal is to bring facts, to bring, you know, scholarship that is rooted in years of research and tremendous reading of secondary sources, to kind of challenge the ways in which history has become part of this culture war. And I think this extends beyond the history profession, and it's something that's really motivated me in terms of my work in public engagement. And when I tell my colleagues across the liberal arts and even outside of the liberal arts that if you're not shaping conversations around your discipline, other people will. And frequently they may have an economic agenda or an ideological agenda or a partisan agenda, and they aren't necessarily staying true to the facts and the actual rigorous research that we do in higher education and across academia. So that's really our goal with Made by History, and we've been around for over 5 years now, and continue to be overwhelmed every day with pitches. So there's just so much great scholarship out there, and opportunities to bring history to shed light on the current landscape. Our goal with GAGE also came out of another frustration, is that we did a call for guest editors in the summer of 2021. We were overwhelmed, just the three of us, with the work, and we really wanted to bring in new voices and new ideas for perhaps writing different types of columns as well. And we looked at the applications, and some of the best ideas for different series, different features came from graduate students or recent PhDs. But they didn't have any training in terms of how editorial experiences. And so we thought, wow, what if we go to the core of this issue and try to integrate training people how to be an editor into graduate curriculum. So again, we can capitalize on these groundbreaking ideas that graduate students have, but also provide training that they can then be qualified to be in these positions as a guest editor later on. And so I've known for a long time that UVA has made it a priority to really invest in training for public engagement. It's something that I have seen with my work and my collaborations with a variety of faculty at UVA. And so I reached out to Will Hitchcock and, you know, mentioned this idea, and he loved it. And he said it really fit into this broader PhD Plus initiative that UVA has introduced. And it's just been, you know, from my point of view, it's been a stunning success because it's an opportunity to teach graduate students the importance of public engagement, why they should do it, how it can help them in terms of their research, also their teaching, and kind of expanding their audiences. It helps with their writing, thinking about the relevance of their argument, all of those types of things. The process of writing a piece pushes them on all of those levels, but also learning how to be an editor. Brianna, Bethany, and Cassandra can talk about this, is another type of skill that you learn, not just writing a piece, but editing another person's piece. You learn a lot about your work. You learn a lot about feedback, how to take feedback. And so I think that there's a lot that we learn as a community coming together during these sessions.
Great, thank you. And I see we already have a question in the chat. Will the course be offered for next J-term? That's an excellent question, Lincoln. And I can't say for certain whether it will or not, but it does seem pretty likely that it will. And if I can get my computer to work right, I actually have the call for applications from last year that I'll put in the chat as soon as I can get it to work, just so you can see just more information, what the application process is. And that was for last year, but it'll likely be pretty similar for next year, if and when it's offered. But yeah, so pivoting from that to the actual student perspective, I want to hear from our other panelists about what motivated you to apply to this workshop and what you got out of it, specifically the op-ed that you published. How did this workshop or how did this experience help you shape that idea and actually, get it into publishable shape, and what, just a little bit about what you learned from that. Let's go in alphabetical order. Bethany, if we could start with you.
Sure, thank you so much. A lot of what motivated me to participate or to apply was what Katie just shared. There's so much news, I think, especially in the past several years, where you see this word unprecedented over and over again. And I really love the approach of the Made by History column, which was to do what historians already do, which is look for continuities, right? And look for how things are changing, and to try and connect the dots so that events that are happening now that seem as though they're unprecedented, they actually have some sort of historical antecedents that historians can bring to the forefront, but do so in a way that's actually accessible and hopefully fun and engaging to read, but that has that sort of weight of research behind it, but that can be consumed in 1100, 1200 words. So I was really drawn to that, and I ended up writing my piece about the role of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in shaping US history curriculum over the past century, or I guess the legacy of what they did over a century ago, and how that continues to play out in debates over history curriculum in the present day, which obviously are on sort of the front pages quite regularly these days. So I did have my piece published in January, right around the time that a Florida bill was passed about the AP African American History course being sort of censored. And so that was a good opportunity for me to make a connection between events, that happened in the, 1800s all the way through to the present day, and try and show those continuities and show how things are similar, how they change over the time, but how there are these antecedents that can kind of inform us where these ideas and impulses are coming from.
Brianna, do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, thanks again, and thanks for everyone for turning out today. Yeah, so what motivated me to participate or to apply for the Made by History workshop, as someone who studies the Civil War era, which is already like a very public, the public has great interest in the Civil War era. And so I, as an academically trained historian, view public engagement with the general public over the Civil War as something that's critical to my job and role as a historian. So being able to really engage with a public audience who already has an interest in Civil War history, and being able to kind of sharpen my skills of communication to that audience, I see as very critical to myself as a historian and to my career. So I really wanted to participate in this workshop to gain those additional skills of writing for a public audience. I feel like speaking to a public audience is one thing, but being able to write for a very broad public audience is a whole different set of skills. And so I was really looking forward to, and certainly learned a lot through this workshop about how to write for a general audience who is already really interested in history. So how do you capture that and push it a step further and challenge those people to continue learning more? So my piece was on the Emancipation Proclamation. So this year, January 1st, 2023 was the 160th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I was pretty struck at how there was very little coverage of that, or barely any. And so I took that as the opportunity to really address how the Emancipation Proclamation was pretty contested in 1863. We think of it today as a very amazing document that did so much, that is very clear in what its goals were. But back during the Civil War, it was actually pretty heavily contested by Northerners and Southerners. And there were a lot of violent reactions to it. So I wanted to highlight that kind of ahead of Black History Month, and how these kind of lessons from the Emancipation Proclamation are still being kind of debated in our society today.
Great, thanks. Cassandra, how about you?
Yeah, I would say that my colleagues covered like the motivations fairly well. I think like as a historian, as historians in training, like we're thinking about like how to communicate all of the work that we do. I know like for me, a big thing is like I always want to communicate with like the communities that I come from, and like I want to know how to do that in the most effective way. And like that's been like an ordering principle for me as I've been in graduate school. So when the opportunity to do this workshop came along, I was immediately attracted to it. I've always been interested in writing just like opinion editorials and like how current events are shaped by historical events. And I've always just kind of had like this vague interest in it, but like something that's a little, I guess, unrefined is probably the best way to put it. So it's like something I've wanted to do, but haven't been quite able to do. And then I saw the workshop and felt like it was the perfect opportunity to like refine these skill sets and to gain more skill sets in terms of like being trained by editors and what it means to be an editor. One thing I think about being graduate students is we're always writers, but never quite always editors, or like that's never really a role that we receive explicit training for. It's something that's kind of just like assumed along the way. So I really appreciated that angle of like what it means to be an editor, what it means to think and write like an editor. And I think like outside of the wonderful reasons that my colleagues have already listed, for me, I guess that's a motivation that was pretty strong.
Yeah, thank you. And for people who are attending who aren't in history disciplines, I just want to point out that, you know, our panelists are all from the history department, but there were participants in the workshop who were from other disciplines too. And since maybe Katie, you could say more about this, the focus of the Made by History column is, of course, history and this historical lens that can potentially inform, you know, understanding of current events and all of that. But could you say more about that? You know, that history can be happening in all of these different disciplines, and perhaps maybe a little bit about how you go about choosing op-eds from all of these pitches that you're getting. What stands out to you? And I'm trying to connect this to Brianna's comment about you know, writing for an audience that's already interested in history. They're coming to this column because they recognize something that they might be interested or curious about. If you could maybe say something about how that, like, finding those places to write for that people who are just interested in your topic or might be going to for answers related to your discipline, how to find those. That's a lot, sorry. Whatever you feel.
I'll start tackling them. First, I would say that, you know, we have had in this workshop, we've had non-historians. I think that just the nature of our column is that we do historical analysis, but we have worked with a variety of other people on how to write op-eds that really bring out their expertise. So we've worked with people in religious studies and I think musicology and English, and, you know, that are looking at literature. So it's tended to be very much the humanities, but I can also say that, you know, having worked with scientists and engineers at Purdue, is that I've worked with, you know, many people about how to actually go through this process, because being an editor, you don't have to be an expert in that particular topic. And in fact, sometimes you're a better editor when you know nothing about the topic and you are coming at it as a reader that doesn't know anything. And so you can say, oh, I don't know that concept. And I think that's one thing that perhaps Brianna, Bethany, and Cassandra can talk about, is that one of the first questions when you are coming in as an editor and you don't know something, you know, asking that, like, when did this actually start? You know, basic things about the timeline that you as an expert might take for granted, or your subfield might take for granted. An editor comes in without knowing it and is really looking for narrative. You know, there's a basic structure that we teach everyone that, again, transcends disciplines, and it's about grabbing your reader with a really effective news hook. I think that one of the great opportunities with breaking news is that it's an opportunity for people who might not think that they want to read history, but they really want to know what's going on with this one thing that's happening in the news. And it's an opportunity to meet them at that news cycle and say, hey, guess what? You need to know history to understand this. And so it can really bring, and I think this is, again, goes across disciplines, that this is an opportunity for you to grab people who might not think that they want to know anything about economics. But in fact, to understand this current issue, they need to. And so I think that's what an editor can do is, you know, think about that news hook, really push the author to come out with the argument, and think about a narrative that makes sense. And so I think that's one of the things that, you know, we really try to teach in the editorial process, because again, you don't have to be a historian to write, or, you know, to be in this workshop, but you have to come at it as an editor. And there are different kinds of questions that you ask as an editor that you would ask as an expert. And I'll just open that up. I don't know if Brianna or Bethany or Cassandra want to talk a little about like what they learned through the editing process that perhaps they didn't necessarily know as a historian coming into this.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that, yeah, I completely agree. Being the editor for, we were the main editor for one piece and a kind of secondary editor for a second piece. And yeah, it really at least illuminated to me how you can't take your own knowledge for granted, you know, writing your own piece, especially when like the three of us are kind of in the depths of writing our own work, our own research, and papers and theses. It's really easy to just take for granted what we already know. But when you're writing for a different audience, for someone who is a non-specialist, you have to take that step back. And I think being an editor really revealed that to me, that you have to explain things a little bit more or phrase things differently to really make what you want to convey super accessible for a general audience, again, who's already interested in history, but also so that you know, you're not alienating anyone who doesn't have a deep knowledge of Civil War history or whatever. So I think it really helped me appreciate a lot more that you know, it's great to have the deep knowledge, but you also have to be able to communicate that in very accessible language.
Yeah, I would also reiterate what Brianna said, and also add that, like, even though I'm thinking specifically about like my group, we were all historians, but our fields were so different. Even I think there were two Americanists in my group, and like we still were like operating like two completely different fields. So like even that, like even being historians and like having some idea of what the other group, like what my colleagues were talking about, like as their editor, like you were able to ask like very simple questions a lot of the times. But also like as you're doing that with the person you're editing, you can also think about it in terms of your own work. Like, is this something that I'm assuming, or is this something that I'm taking for granted? Like, it sort of trains you to better catch those things, I would say. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add, it's a really great exercise. Editing while writing is a really great exercise in empathy, because as you're looking at someone else's work, deliberately to find constructive ways to help support them to make it better, you're also thinking about, oh, okay, you know, my work has a lot of room for improvement as well. So as someone in the process of writing something that's incomplete, that needs to be improved, that has room for improvement, you have that lens when you're looking at someone else's work. And so it really helps you adopt this posture of the goal is to support like the piece, and to make the person and the piece, you know, get to the place where it can be as good as possible. And so I think I really appreciated doing those two things at the same time, and how it really helps you understand and approach it with a lot of empathy.
Yeah, great. So we have a couple more questions in the chat that are all on kind of the workshop itself and the PhD Plus workshop, which I'll get to at the end. So I'm not going to ignore those questions. I'll just save those for the end. But if anybody has questions for the panelists, otherwise, yeah, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself. At this point, we can open it up to questions. But in the meantime, I'm curious to our grad students. Oh, okay, so good. I don't have to ask that question. So Brittany is asking, for those who have published, did you read the comments on your op-ed? How did you deal with negative ones, if there were any? That was actually a question I was going to ask. I'm really curious what sort of response you got to your op-eds and how you dealt with that.
I'll just go first.
Go ahead, Cassandra, go.
Okay, yeah. So during the workshop, I wrote an op-ed, I think also like very similar to Bethany's, about like critical race theory and like the history of education, which is like my field, but also my field is the history of a place, Pittsburgh, or the Greater Ohio River Valley. So I actually came to my piece not from the workshop, but from like an event that happened in the news. And I think that like my issue was probably pretty tame in terms of like as far as things go. It was mostly about like disasters and capitalism and like how corporations tend to mess up the environment. And I do think that like that's something that doesn't really ruffle a lot of feathers. So I don't even think I had any comments on mine the last time I checked. So there was just not a lot to deal with. And I think that's just a nature of the issue that I was writing on.
Katie, can I ask, do you get comments behind the scenes that aren't, you know, the publicly made comments on the articles?
I mean, sometimes we definitely have some people that, you know, are upset about something. And they will let us know. Absolutely, they'll let us know. If there is an error, like a factual error, people will let us know. And you know, there's a process by that to issue a correction, and it happens in journalism all the time. I mean, you don't want to make an error, but if you do, the standard is it's pretty easy to kind of go through and make a correction, or sometimes it's a clarification that it's actually, you know, it could be misinterpreted. And so I think that Bethany spoke about this. You know, the goal is to have it be the most honest piece possible. And so sometimes if there's something that needs to be clarified, we do that as well. The first op-ed I ever wrote was for Reuters, and my editor there, she told me as soon as it went up, she said, Katie, it's a great piece. Do not read the comment section. Just don't do it. And I was like, what? Like, of course I want to, it's feedback. She's like, no, that's not. She's like, they are not arguing with your piece. They're arguing with like about things that have nothing to do with you. And that's exactly what is, if you actually look through the comment section, and I mean, I did for the first couple of pieces, and then I realized that, oh, this is actually nothing to do with me. And that, you know, people just want to, it's anonymous, right? And like, they just want to go in there and fight with other people. And so I always tell people, don't read the comment section. You know, some of the, like, you know, pieces that go viral, you know, especially in conservative media, some of those comments, they're not in good faith. They don't actually engage with the material. And so I always, you know, tell authors that it's hard sometimes if you have to turn off your notifications, make your account private in worst case scenarios. It can be hard, but it's not about you and it's not about your work. It's about some of these other broader issues, and certainly a piece, you know, we've had pieces that have been featured on Fox News, and that do not fairly like they're not treating the piece and the actual content of the piece fairly. And if someone's not going to engage in your work and your argument in good faith, we just encourage people not to respond, just to ignore that. If you know, you have different colleagues in your field, I think the more common thing though, so that does happen. But I think a way to kind of ward off any negative critiques is to just make sure that the research is grounded in your knowledge, that you know it to be true. And this is what we tell all of our authors: go through the last version and make sure that you know everything in there is rooted in your research, is rooted in secondary scholarship, that you have sources for everything, that you've got the receipts, if you will. And I think if that's the case, then if people, criticize it and it goes viral in kind of a negative capacity, then you have no control over that, but you can be proud that you got the best scholarship out there. And then you actually will find that it can help it can help you forge networks in academia, outside of academia, because many people will then be reading your piece, and they may not be the vocal ones, but they may be the ones that email you and say, I really learned this great thing from your piece, or, hey, I'm working on this exhibit and I need someone who's an expert on this to add to it. Can you do that? And so it can create a lot of those reverberations, can really create a lot of opportunities inside and outside of academia.
Great. Brianna and Bethany, did either of you get feedback on your articles?
Yes, so Katie and Carly definitely said do not read the comments. And I did try to adhere to that, but I sent it to my mom and she read all the comments. And then she said, okay, they're actually all good. So when after I was cleared, I went back and read them. And thankfully the comments on the actual piece were quite positive. And then when I shared it in different social media outlets and with family and friends, mostly it was people kind of confirming what I had written about. And most people were saying things like, oh, I learned these things when I was at school, in the 80s or in the 60s. And my grandchild, who's in school today is still learning these same things. I can't believe, that's still going on. So a lot of it was really affirming and confirming what I had written about in the piece, which was that there are these patterns of trying to suppress Black history, African-American history, the history of the Civil War and slavery that obviously go back well over a century. And so that was really encouraging. And then I had a friend who wrote about my piece from a very personal experience and just talking about growing up in school and sitting in class and, just it was a moment of maybe not revelation, but reflection that they hadn't had in a really long time. And they made that connection based on reading my piece to that experience in their own elementary school time. So that was really cool. But I had to get a proofreader for the comments before I dove in.
That's such a great idea.
Yeah, I also looked at the comments. It's hard to resist. And I'd say, just like Bethany, for my piece, they were largely positive, although there were a few individuals who decided to get into a fight with each other over something totally unrelated to the piece. And so that was pretty entertaining to read that thread, which was just, going down a random, I think, military history rabbit hole that, again, had nothing to do with anything I wrote about. So I'd say that it was again largely positive, and probably shouldn't have read them, but again, it was hard to resist, and actually was pretty nice to see how I'm sure this isn't the case all the time, but how people actually really liked it and really engaged with the piece and responded, that it resonated well with a large number of those who decided to leave comments.
Yeah, I'm curious for Brianna, Bethany, and Cassandra, whether this was something you were concerned about before you started writing or as you were formulating your idea. And similarly for Katie, I'm curious whether you see authors sort of self-censoring in the writing or editing process, worried about getting negative feedback or comments.
I would say for me, during the process of writing, what Katie said, I really stuck with that, to just make sure everything is factually correct. And as sort of the thing of that's the thing that I can control. And that's the thing that I can do on my end to make sure that anything bad, at the end of the day, is not necessarily something that I caused, if that makes any sense. So I think while I was writing it, it's usually like very minor changes in like the way that you might phrase something. Is that framing correct? Or am I like suggesting or implying something that's like incorrect by writing it in this way? Am I adding something that's a little more like fluff than fact? Like just to be like very attuned to those like very minor things that could be so easily misconstrued. I think for me was the only way that it really affected the writing process. This is also like a very, it's not a thesis, it's not 10,000 words. So like it's much easier to focus on line by line to like only say exactly what you want to say and like nothing more than that. And I think in terms of like negative feedback, I felt like as long as I was saying exactly what I wanted to say and exactly what I could defend, then like I think for me that was the motive, like what motivated me to sort of like shut out the the negative possibilities.
Yeah, similarly, I really like what Cassandra said about going line by line and just making sure that everything there is obviously factual, accurate, and really what you want to communicate. I had a slight concern because even though my piece is obviously about history, I was writing about an organization that is still active today, maybe not sort of widely active, but still has chapters. The United Daughters of Confederacy still has chapters in many different states, not just across the South, but the Midwest, the West, sort of all over. But they've already sort of been in the spotlight, a lot to do with Confederate monuments. And obviously there has not been a particularly, warm response to removing Confederate monuments over the past several years. So talking about that specific organization, which is still active, which is still, in existence and not just a sort of a relic of history. I did have a slight concern about that people might respond to that negatively. But again, the comments were mostly positive. So.
Yeah, I'd say that I wasn't, overly concerned about anything. Again, I feel like my topic was just kind of what Cassandra said. I didn't really see it as controversial, although, maybe others could interpret it that way. But I was never really concerned enough to like self-censor what I was writing. Again, it was all based in scholarship and my own research for my dissertation. So I was fairly confident in the material that if there were any challenges to it or people asking for clarification or anything like that, that I felt confident enough that I would be able to kind of meet them there and discuss it and kind of intellectually have a conversation about it. So I never was too concerned about that. I mean, of course, as graduate students, it's always maybe a little nerve-wracking to make bold claims and to have bold statements. But I think that doing the kind of releasing and publishing through the Made by History column was a very like constructive and protective way of dipping your toes into that water, into that realm, whereas it was fairly contained and I don't think that if things were to get out of hand or have negative comments, I'm sure that there would be the Washington Post would step in and help out there. So I was never really concerned, and I'm glad to hear that my colleagues weren't really either.
Yeah, it's interesting, to answer that question and also to lead into Dan's question in the chat is that a lot of our authors are actually more concerned about what people in their subfield will think of it. And they're like, oh, I can't say that because that's actually like really highly debated, the impact of this policy. Some people argue this and that. And we're like, the broader public doesn't care about this historiographical debate, right? And so it's kind of that, and I think that's one of those tensions is that you have to make something can still be complicated, but you have to convey it simply. And I think that finding the right language that will not open you up to criticism from academics, but can also relate kind of a complex debate to a broader public in a simplistic way, that is the perpetual challenge. And I think that's something that our authors are always worried about because they're so used to peer review and academic kind of these smaller academic circles that they want to reach the broader public, but they don't want to sacrifice that rigor. And I think that is something that we take a lot of pride in our column, that we're able to do both. But it involves a lot of debates, a lot of, okay, we can't cite 12 or have 12 different names of historians in a piece. Like you'll just have to, use hyperlinks. And so the citation process is a little bit different. We still cite everything and we have our authors cite everything, but it's just a little bit different. You can't name drop every time. So there are little things that we kind of work with our authors on how to make it clear that they're drawing on other secondary scholarship and they're perhaps weighing into historiographical debate, but not to make that something that would kind of make the public tune out. And so that's a constant kind of battle with, and I think that's something that a lot of our authors think about, and we get into a lot of discussions with how to not sacrifice some of these the rigor but still have the reach. And I think that goes to Dan's point, is that the readership and the audience of Made by History is that we have pieces that, get 500,000 views. And so that's clearly not all historians. But I think our everyday readers tend to be historians or people who are interested in history, as Brianna mentioned before. We have a strong readership among professional historians, and I think that is fantastic because it's an opportunity for people to get their work out there to their colleagues. I know that so many people know my work. My first book about entertainment and politics and the celebrity presidency, not because they've read my book, but because they've read pieces that I've written for Made by History and broader op-eds. And so I think that's actually something that's frequently overlooked in our conversations about op-ed writing, is that we always think we're connecting with a broader public, and we are. But we're also connecting with a range of different colleagues, like in your fields as well, who might read your op-ed, but wouldn't necessarily read through the entire book. And so I think that creates a lot of opportunities, networking opportunities within academia, as well as outside of academia as well. And we also know that a lot of our readership are historians because we have a newsletter as well. And we can kind of actually see who's reading it in terms of the actual email addresses. And we know that becomes, the newsletter then becomes a way that people think about what they're going to assign in the classroom. And so our pieces have this other life as well, that they become teaching resources and people assign them in their classrooms. So then you get, a classroom of 40 or maybe 200 who are also reading and engaging with your work. And I also would highlight that, I don't know if Dan, if you want to share anything as well, but Dan is our most recent person to publish a piece. He just published a piece today that is about kind of the history of fingerprinting and how, Trump was able to kind of evade the stigma that has gone with that during the indictment yesterday. And so we have another piece that he's a part of the Jefferson Scholars program. And so more people that can talk about the process as well. If you want to add anything, Dan, in terms of your work.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have a lot to add other than I thought it was really engaging to write and to think about kind of the larger debate. I would say I was nervous about writing about the Trump indictment just because I know that's going to get a lot of attention. There will be a lot of people looking for someone to get angry at about the Trump indictment. So I thought a lot in the piece about how to keep the discussion rooted on the experience of ordinary people who are getting fingerprinted and not to focus too much on Trump himself. But it was a really enjoyable process. So for anyone who's considering contributing, I really enjoyed it.
That's great. Congrats, Dan. I'm excited about that. And that actually leads into a question that I had. A lot of you have written these op-eds that are very timely. And I think that's one of the big pieces of advice that we give to people who are interested in writing op-eds. Look for events in the news that are happening that are relevant to your topic and connect it to those things. And I'm curious, as busy grad students, as busy academics, how do you manage that, keeping your eye out for things that you could write about and managing that writing process in a really short time span?
I think this is an interesting question because I actually wrote the piece that was published from a pitch to a piece. I didn't use my workshop piece. And that was interesting because I had seen, I wrote about the East Palestine train derailment, and I had seen it happen in the news and I had been seeing a little bit about it, but I didn't see a whole lot of buzz around it. And I don't know how to quantify the difference between people talking about something and the difference between a lot of people talking about something. But I had been thinking about it and how close it was to the Pittsburgh, which is the city that I am from and where where my research centers on, and how that wasn't necessarily clear because it's a small town in Ohio. But it's the major metropolitan center is Pittsburgh. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about Denora, which is a story that I actually learned growing up in the city of Pittsburgh. And I remember just looking at my partner and I was just have you ever heard of this? And he was like, no. So I was like, okay, this might be worth looking into. And as I looked into it, I was like, okay, so I remember I had class and it was the beginning of the semester. So the course load was fairly light, and there wasn't too many things monopolizing my time. So I said, if I'm going to write about it, I should do it now. And I think the first thing that I did was okay, where do we start? And I literally pulled up my workshop materials and I was like, okay, start by writing the pitch. If I can get through the pitch, then there might be something here. And then send it off to Katie and Carly and see what they think. So I worked on a pitch and kind of nailed down what I was trying to talk about, and what the idea was. And I was like, okay, there is something here. And I sent it to Katie and Carly and they were like, okay, there is something here. So we kind of went through that editorial process, I want to say over the course of a week or so. And just, it was a matter of extending sort of the pitch into the op-ed length piece almost, for me at least. And it was just researching and writing in times that I wasn't going to class or working on stuff for class. So setting aside a couple of hours at the end of the day to just get through this. And I think for me, having experienced the workshop, I knew exactly how much time was needed to do each step. So I could understand that it's not this big undertaking necessarily. It's something that happens in sort of chunks almost. And so I need 2 hours here, 2 hours here, maybe a little longer here. And just from there, I could fit it into my day pretty manageably. And I think understanding that's not something I would have understood before the workshop. So I think that was fairly important to me, understanding that this is a process and it can be fit within my day. I just have to fit it within my day.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with Cassandra writing a piece, responding to something that happened in the moment and going through the whole writing and editing process so quickly. I think my piece came from the workshop, but I think one of the reasons why I was able to use it is because I chose a topic that is sort of ongoing, right? And so it could kind of be massaged and sort of worked on to meet a headline, to meet something that was happening in the moment. Because when I originally wrote my piece, I framed it mostly around Virginia and around efforts that Governor Youngkin and the State Board of Education here in the state of Virginia were doing to change the state standards. They had drastically reduced them from a sort of really robust list of state standards for history and social studies, and had shortened them and cut out a lot of really essential content. And so that was my hook, right? That was my news hook, but it's sort of wild to me how quickly these sort of become old, right? So it was old by the time I finished my piece after a couple of weeks. And so because it's an issue that continues to come up and many different states are, passing different kinds of legislation to restrict teaching of history. We just sort of had to wait, right, for for another moment like that, and it happened in Florida. And so Katie and Carly actually reached out to me and said, "Hey, this is a good time to run your piece. It just needs to be changed." And so I think within 4 days, made a couple more rounds of edits to make sure that the hook was right for the actual news event. But the main content of the piece kind of worked because it was addressing an issue that wasn't state specific. It was a broader pattern of behavior that was happening across many states. So just found the hook, made those edits with lots of support from Katie and Carly and another one of their colleagues, and that's how I was able to get published.
Yeah, my piece was, I'd say, maybe similar to Bethany, kind of a response to something going on, or the lack of something going on in the news cycle, how Emancipation Proclamation wasn't being covered, and that is kind of a big deal, I thought. So my piece actually had a kind of a ticking timeline, I guess. So we got mine out on the very last day of January, looking ahead to Black History Month. But one thing I seem to remember from the workshop, and Bethany and Cassandra can correct me if I'm wrong, is that Katie and Carly encouraged us to write about something that we were interested in and passionate about, and a time would come when it would be very relevant to the news cycle. So I think that was really whereas my piece I felt was kind of timed to the news cycle, or at least had a specific amount of time before it would become unrelevant or irrelevant. I liked the approach of writing about something that you were passionate about and interested in, and just having it ready to go whenever that moment arose in the news cycle. And of course that means keeping your ear to the ground for that news cycle, but being able to have something that's percolating in the news, like Bethany and Cassandra were saying, that there will come a time when that is a main story, and then that's when your piece can be published and super relevant. The workshop was pretty intensive, I'd say, writing the piece in a short period of time. So thankfully it was over J-term, at least for me. But I think, again, having that in the back of your mind of something that you're interested in, and really have that deep knowledge about, but are also are excited to share with others, is really important to crafting one of these pieces. And just you might have to wait a little bit until it is news relevant, but that'll make it all that much more impactful in the moment.
Yeah, sorry to
Oh, go ahead, Cassandra.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Brianna said about how these topics will come. I do remember Katie and Carly saying something to that effect, and it's one of the reasons I was kind of relaxed about the piece that I wrote in the workshop. For me, it felt like I was trying to force a connection that wasn't necessarily there, or more so not that it wasn't there, and that it was too abstract, I would say, and a bit chaotic. So for me, understanding that there will be something that comes that I will have an interest in and that I will want to write about. I think that was important in sort of lowering the stakes almost. It doesn't have to be this right now. You have to figure out everything, or just have this piece developed. There will be a time where what you're interested in comes of value in the news. And I think that sort of piece for me was very motivating, but also relaxing. It lowered the stakes.
Yeah, I think that it's that combination, right, of being patient and waiting, knowing that, again, if you have highlighted something that is an enduring issue, it will come into the news, and just being patient on it and being creative as well. I think, Brianna and I talked about, what if we kind of tie the history of Emancipation Proclamation with the fact that we have January is also the month of the insurrection, and how don't these actually two anniversaries tell us something together? And so, you can be patient, you can be creative in terms of thinking about that lead. But then when something comes into the news, being quick, being quick about it. And I think that's something with Cassandra's piece, with Dan's piece today, is that there's a moment. And so when there is a moment, clearing the time to make it a priority is so that you can meet that news cycle. And the strategy to do that is to, again, write things when they come to you, so you kind of have a draft of what you're passionate about, and then you can easily tweak it, as we did with Bethany's piece as well. That, okay, we knew this, we knew she had it, and it was a lot easier to just rewrite the introduction, but have that key argument and that body already done. And so that's a way that you can prepare for the news cycle. And then, again, just be patient, but when the moment comes, move quickly and make it a priority so you can really capitalize on the interest in that topic for that moment.
Great. So we have 3 minutes left, and I have one final question for Bethany, Brianna, and Cassandra. I'm really curious whether you plan to write another op-ed in the near future, and or how you imagine this kind of work being part of your career in the future?
Yes, definitely to further op-ed writing. This was a really, really valuable experience to be doing this, especially early in my academic career as a historian, doing other kinds of writing and just seeing the value of writing for a broader audience, writing for a public audience. I had a professor recently who said, all history should be public history, but of course, all history isn't necessarily publicly accessible. And so I see this as an absolutely essential way of sharing history, in a more public way. So yes, I would love to continue writing for op-ed, and it's just really made me appreciate the value of working with other people. I think that sometimes when you're writing, especially in academia, it can be a very lonely, very solo endeavor. And so it just made me really want to reach out and get more feedback and connect with more people, especially in that editing process. And just seeing the way that my piece transformed, it was, I think good when I started it. And by the time that I had gotten, 3 or 4 rounds of edits from different people, I was really impressed by the contributions that they made and how it really forced me to improve the piece overall. And so I think those are some of the best takeaways for me.
Yeah, I would just kind of echo what Bethany said. I think one thing that I've really learned from this workshop is that writing is always a process. No matter how good of a writer you are, and so you can always get better. And I think that I really like that. I really like continuing to hone those skills and see what really sticks out to people and what resonates with them. That was one thing that surprised me a little bit with my piece, is parts of it that I thought people would connect with better, actually, like, they didn't. And it was other more peripheral things that resonated most with people. So that was really informative and to me. So I think continuing the process of writing and learning how to write and how to craft arguments and pieces for the public, and to, again, challenge them to continue to get interested in history is something that I certainly want to continue throughout the rest of my career. Again, I think public engagement is critical to a historian's role, a historian's job, and so I think this is a perfect outlet for that, for graduate students and also early career historians as well.
Yeah, I would also agree. I would agree with my colleagues in that, like, it was a very meaningful experience. I think for me, like, I know now that I am very interested in short form, so I would love to do another op-ed on what, I don't know. I think we're at that place in the semester where, like, work sort of monopolizes my time, so I haven't had, like, a lot of time to think about that deeply. But I do know that, like, that's someplace I want to continue towards in the future.
Great, thank you all so much. So we're out of time, and I did want to get to those 2 questions that we had earlier. Is PhD Plus offering the Writing Op-eds workshop soon? This is the workshop that PhD Plus organizes with Brian Rosenwald, who's also an editor of Made by History. And we do hope to offer that soon. We don't have plans on the books, but hopefully at least by the fall, we'll be able to offer that again. And Katie, around how many students does the GAGE Made by History workshop take?
We really like 9. And Brianna, Bethany, and Cassandra can tell you the reason why, because we do groups of 3. So we like numbers that can be divided by 3. So generally 9 is our ideal number because it's big enough where we can get a diversity of perspectives and, you know, kind of bring in, but it's small enough so it's still a tight-knit community and we can have our working groups of 3.
Awesome, great. Yeah, so keep your eyes open for an announcement on that later in the fall, hopefully for J term again. So thank you everybody for this. This was really a wonderful discussion, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time to talk to us about your experience and your work. And if anybody has follow-up questions for me or anybody else, feel free to email me and I can get those questions to the right people. But otherwise, thank you again for taking some time on this very probably busy April day, and enjoy the rest of the day. Hopefully you have nice weather where you are and can enjoy it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.